More now on our top story, the unrest that we've seen in the Iranian capital, Tehran. Negar Mortazavi is an Iranian-American journalist and commentator in Washington, joins me live now from the US capital. So in some ways, there has been this sort of struggle to understand recent demonstrations that we've seen, conflicting demonstrations in Iran, and then how to reconcile that with the massive turnout in processions for the funeral of Qasem Soleimani. Help us to understand the nature of these recent protests in Iran.
Sure. So just to be clear, it's a diverse society with different views, sometimes very polarized. So yes, we saw millions of people coming out condemning the U.S. for the assassination of the top general. And then now we see thousands of people. Obviously, when the protests are anti-government, there's a much higher risk compared to when you're trying to support the government coming out for a similar funeral. So now we see people really angry and this sense of mistrust or condemning of the government because of the shooting down of the civilian plane. These are not necessarily contradictory because I've actually spoken to people who see an overlap. So reformists specifically, the internal opposition, the political factions within Iran who operate but are at the same time critical of the hardliners and the IRGC, had at the same time condemned the killing of Qasem Soleimani last week. But this week, they're also condemning the government. So this is an internal, basically a domestic crisis for the government, one of transparency, of taking responsibility, or actually preventing this tragedy of the plane to begin with. But the Qasem Soleimani assassination was seen as an escalation from the outside, which was basically taking Iran towards more conflict with the U.S. and a potential war, which many Iranians are fearing and don't want to see.
I suppose throughout this debate, there is this need right now to try to gauge how much support or indeed opposition there is towards the government in Tehran.
There is indeed. So today in the protests yesterday and today, we hear a lot of anti-government, very radical, basically political slogans right at the regime, basically condemning the regime, top leaders asking for people to resign or for the government to be overthrown, similar to the protests that we saw back in November. Just 2 months ago, there were anti-government protests across the country. Hundreds of thousands of people came. Security forces cracked down really brutally. Hundreds of protesters were killed. But then at the same time, you have this other part of the population that came out last week for the funeral of Soleimani. So it's hard to, absent real clear opinion polls, it's hard to pinpoint a specific percentage of what Iranians want, what they don't want, what each portion of the population wants. But I think what's clear, at least from the last presidential election, which is closest to an opinion poll you can get in Iran, is that the majority voted for the president who wanted engagement with the U.S., who wanted negotiations or a nuclear deal, as opposed to hardliners who have promoted the opposite. So upcoming elections, parliamentary elections, and then the year after we have presidential elections.
Interesting what you say about the reformist movement and there being this need to see the government engage with the United States and for there to be negotiations and dialogue. Is that sentiment still there with President Trump in the White House?
Not as much. We've seen basically the moderates weakened more and more in Iran in the past 2 years, the path to diplomacy and real engagement with the U.S. really being limited, if not closed. But what I was trying to get at was the absence of opinion polls. So nobody can with confidence come and tell you what the majority of the Iranians want. Do they want a confrontation? Do they want more diplomacy? The last time we heard from the entire population was when they voted for the one candidate who was basically going for more engagement and more deal. And then President Trump pulled out of that deal, and now the two countries are in a path to more escalation and possible tension. And I have to also mention, we see the commanders now in charge. We see the IRGC calling the shots in Iran, and we see catastrophes like this downing of the civilian plane basically being the consequence of a war that hasn't even started. So imagine basically the fallout if an actual conflict were to break between Iran and the U.S.
Negar Mortazavi, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us on the NewsHour.